73 employees watched Dante Ferraro terminate the quiet librarian in the back row of the company meeting, and not a single one of them understood why he spent the next 6 weeks unable to get her out of his head. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from, because what actually happened in that meeting room is not even close to what it looked like. Nadia Cole had worked as the private archivist and librarian for the Ferraro family's estate library for 14 months, plus size, warm brown skin, dark curly hair she kept in a loose twist held together with a pencil most days. The kind of calm, focused presence that made the massive, dust-heavy collection of rare manuscripts she managed feel like the most important room in the entire building. She was 28, sharp-eyed, patient in the particular way of someone who had spent years learning that the most valuable information is almost always hiding in the thing nobody else bothered to read carefully. She had not expected to be fired. Certainly not publicly, in front of every single employee gathered for the quarterly operations meeting, and certainly not by Dante Ferraro himself, a man she had spoken to exactly 4 times in 14 months, each exchange lasting no longer than a minute, each one leaving her with the unsettling impression that he was paying far more attention to her than the brevity of the conversation suggested. Dante Ferraro ran the largest private import and security consulting firm on the Eastern Seaboard, a business that on paper handled corporate protection and rare acquisitions and, beneath that careful surface, maintained the kind of connections that made him one of the most quietly powerful men in the city. He was 36, tall, dark-haired, sharp jaw, controlled in the way of a man who had learned decades ago that showing less always accomplished more than showing everything. A faded tattoo traced the side of his neck, disappearing below his collar, and his right hand carried ink that most people noticed but nobody ever asked about twice. He had fired Nadia because he had no other choice, though nobody in that room, including Nadia herself, understood that yet. "Ms. Cole," he had said, his voice flat and controlled in the meeting, not looking at her directly, which she noticed and filed away because she noticed most things. "Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Please collect your belongings and speak with Elena in HR before the end of day." 73 people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The librarian, the quiet one nobody ever thought about, fired publicly, without warning, in the middle of a routine meeting, by a man who typically delegated personnel decisions entirely to his operations team. Nadia had sat very still for exactly 3 seconds, processing the information with the same careful, methodical attention she gave every difficult piece of text she had ever catalogued. Then she stood, gathered her notebook, and walked out of the room without a word, her spine straight, her expression composed, refusing to give a single person in that room the satisfaction of watching her fall apart publicly. If you think you already know where this story is going, stay with it, because what Dante actually did in that meeting and why is going to rewrite everything you assumed in the first 30 seconds. She was cleaning out her desk in the archive room 40 minutes later when Elena appeared in the doorway, looking genuinely distressed rather than simply professional, which told Nadia something important had been left out of the public termination. "There is an envelope for you," Elena said, setting it on the desk. "Mr. Ferraro asked me to deliver it personally, and to tell you his exact words, to read it before you leave the building." Nadia studied Elena's face carefully. "You do not agree with what happened in that meeting," she said. "It was not a question." "I was not consulted," Elena said, which was answer enough. Once Elena left, Nadia opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, handwritten, not printed, and she recognized the handwriting from margin notes she had occasionally found in the library's oldest manuscripts. Notes she had always assumed belonged to Dante's father but now realized, with a small shock, had been Dante's own. The note read, "The archive contains something a dangerous man wants badly enough to hurt anyone connected to it. I cannot explain further inside this building. Firing you publicly was the only way to sever your visible connection to the collection before he identifies you as the person with direct access to it. I am sorry. Meet me at the address below tonight at 8 if you are willing to hear the rest. If you are not, I understand completely, and I will ensure your severance is generous. D." Nadia read the note twice, then folded it carefully into her jacket pocket and finished packing her desk with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to every task in 14 months of working for a man she was only now beginning to realize she had never actually understood at all. That is exactly where everything shifts, and if you want to understand what Dante was actually protecting Nadia from, and why firing her publicly was the only move that kept her safe, stay with this. The address was a small restaurant in a part of the city Nadia had never visited, the kind of place that existed without signage, known only to people who already knew it was there. Dante was already seated when she arrived, in a dark corner booth, no security visible, looking far less controlled than she had ever seen him in 14 months of careful, distant observation. "Thank you for coming," he said, standing when she approached, pulling out her chair in an old-fashioned gesture that felt, to her surprise, entirely genuine rather than performed. "You owe me a far better explanation than a handwritten note," Nadia said, sitting down, her voice steady despite the real confusion sitting underneath it. "I do," Dante agreed, "and I intend to give you one." Over the following hour, Dante laid out a situation Nadia had never suspected existed beneath the careful surface of the estate library she had managed so diligently. A rare manuscript in the collection, one Nadia herself had catalogued 8 months earlier without fully understanding its significance, contained financial records dating back 3 generations. Records that documented the original terms of a territorial agreement between Dante's family and a rival organization run by a man named Salvatore Voss. "Voss believes those records contain enough evidence to challenge my family's legal claim to the port contracts we have held for 30 years, Dante said. "He has spent 6 months trying to locate the specific manuscript, and 3 weeks ago, one of his people identified you as the archivist with direct, daily access to the collection." Nadia felt cold settle in her stomach. "Identified me how?" "A delivery driver we now believe was working for Voss noticed you entering and exiting the archive room consistently over several months," Dante said. "Your schedule was regular enough to confirm you were the primary person managing the collection. That made you the most efficient path to the manuscript, either through cooperation or through far less pleasant means." Something sharp rose in Nadia's chest, fear tangled together with a growing, uncomfortable clarity. "You fired me publicly to make it look like I no longer have access," she said slowly, the logic clicking into place with the same precision she applied to every cataloging puzzle. "If Voss believes I have been severed from the collection entirely, approaching me becomes pointless." "Exactly," Dante said. "I could not warn you in advance without risking the information reaching Voss through channels I do not fully control yet. The firing had to look genuine, sudden, and public, or it would not have been convincing to anyone watching from outside." Nadia sat with that for a long moment, processing the full weight of what he was telling her. "You could have simply moved the manuscript," she said. "Hidden it, destroyed it, removed the threat entirely without involving me at all." "I considered that," Dante admitted. "The manuscript cannot be destroyed without destroying legal protections my own family needs for the port contracts. And moving it without proper archival handling risks damaging records that are genuinely irreplaceable. I need someone who understands that collection well enough to handle the manuscript safely while we figure out how to neutralize Voss's claim permanently." "You need me," Nadia said flatly. "I need you," Dante confirmed, something in his voice shifting out of careful control into something more honest. "Professionally, because you are the only person who has actually cataloged that collection thoroughly enough to handle this safely. And personally, because I have spent 14 months watching you work from a distance that I maintained because I understood clearly that becoming visibly close to anyone in my world puts them at risk. The irony of Voss targeting you anyway has not escaped me." Something warm and complicated moved through Nadia's chest at the quiet admission buried in the middle of the practical explanation. 14 months is a long time to watch someone from a distance, she said carefully. "It is," Dante agreed. "I am not proud of the distance. I am simply honest about why it existed." If you caught the specific thing he just admitted underneath the professional explanation, you are paying exactly the kind of attention this story rewards, because what happens over the following weeks is going to test both of them. They agreed that evening to a careful arrangement. Nadia would work privately, from a secure location Dante's security team provided, cataloging and preserving the critical manuscript while Dante's legal team built a case to neutralize Voss's claim through proper channels rather than confrontation. To the outside world, Nadia remained fired, disconnected from the Ferraro estate entirely, the public severance making her invisible to Voss's surveillance. The secure location turned out to be a converted brownstone in a quiet residential neighborhood, furnished simply, with a small but well-equipped workspace Dante had clearly arranged specifically for archival work, proper lighting, climate-controlled storage, and, Nadia noticed with a complicated feeling, a small electric kettle and the specific brand of tea she drank every afternoon in the archive, a detail she had never mentioned to anyone but which Dante had apparently noticed during 14 months of quiet observation. "You knew what tea I drink," she said, when he arrived the following morning to review the workspace. Something almost like embarrassment crossed his controlled features. "I notice things," he said, "particularly things that belong to people I have been paying more attention to than I probably should have been. That is either very thoughtful or very unsettling," Nadia said. "I have not decided which yet." "Take whatever time you need deciding," Dante said. "I am not going anywhere in the meantime." Over the following weeks, working in close proximity for the first time since Nadia had started at the estate, whatever careful distance Dante had maintained for 14 months dissolved steadily under the weight of genuine, daily interaction. Nadia discovered that the controlled, distant man she had barely spoken to for over a year was, underneath the composure, genuinely curious, dry-humored, and far lonelier than his careful public persona suggested. The first real conversation that mattered, the one that shifted something permanently between them, happened on the 4th day at the brownstone, over sandwiches Dante had brought from a deli neither of them had visited before. "Can I ask you something personal?" Nadia said, setting down her work for the first time all morning. "Yes," Dante said, with far less hesitation than she expected. "Why a library?" Nadia asked. "Your family could have stored those manuscripts in a bank vault, a secure facility, anywhere far less exposed than a working collection managed by a single archivist. Why build an actual library around them?" Something softened in Dante's careful expression, an old memory surfacing. "My grandmother started the collection," he said. "She arrived in this country with almost nothing except an obsessive love of books. My grandfather, who was far less romantic about things than she was, built the library for her because she asked him to, which was apparently enough reason for a man who did not read anything beyond contracts to construct an entire wing of his house around his wife's passion." "That is a far more tender origin story than I expected," Nadia said. "Most things in my family have far more tender origins than the reputation suggests," Dante said. "The tenderness simply gets buried under decades of careful control, until nobody remembers it was ever there at all." "You sound like you are describing yourself as much as the family," Nadia observed. Dante looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded crossing his expression. "I might be," he admitted. "I have spent many years burying every soft thing about myself under the version of me this business seems to require. You are the first person in a very long time who has made me want to find the softer version again." Something in Nadia's chest moved at that, warm and slightly overwhelming. "The softer version seems far more interesting than the one in the meeting room," she said gently. "I am hoping you will give me enough time to prove that," Dante said. Dante discovered that Nadia, freed from the professional restraint of working in his building, was sharper, funnier, and more direct than 14 months of brief, careful exchanges had ever allowed him to fully see. "You are far different in person than I expected," he admitted one afternoon, watching her work through a particularly fragile section of the manuscript with practiced, careful hands. "You expected the quiet librarian from the back row of your meeting," Nadia said, not looking up from her work. "I expected someone who would be far more intimidated by this situation than you appear to be," Dante said. "I have spent my entire career handling things that are fragile and valuable and easily damaged by carelessness," Nadia said. "This situation is not fundamentally different from that. It simply carries higher stakes than most manuscripts I have worked with." Something warm and genuinely admiring crossed Dante's expression at that, the specific respect Nadia was beginning to recognize as the way he looked at competence he had not anticipated finding. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Renzo, Dante's head of security, raised the concern directly roughly 3 weeks into the arrangement. "You are spending significant time at that location personally," Renzo observed. "More than the security review requires. People are beginning to ask questions about why you are visiting a terminated employee's workspace regularly." "People can ask whatever questions they want," Dante said flatly. "The manuscript work requires my direct involvement." "The manuscript work requires her direct involvement," Renzo corrected gently. "Your presence there is something else entirely, and I think we both know that. Dante was quiet for a long moment. You are not wrong, he finally admitted. I do not entirely know how to manage what is happening there. Renzo, I spent 14 months maintaining distance specifically to avoid this exact situation, and the universe apparently decided that was not going to be permitted. Nadia, meanwhile, found herself increasingly preoccupied with something that had nothing to do with the manuscript or Voss's threat. She had begun noticing the specific way Dante watched her work, not the careful, distant observation from 14 months of professional separation, but something far warmer and more present. He brought her tea without being asked. He asked genuine, curious questions about the archival process. He stayed later than security reviews required, finding small reasons to extend conversations that had nothing to do with the work itself. A woman named Isabella, one of Dante's longtime business associates, visited the brownstone unexpectedly one afternoon to deliver documents, and Nadia watched the easy, familiar way Isabella touched Dante's arm while speaking to him, the shared history evident in their shorthand, the casual intimacy of people who had known each other for years. Something sharp and unfamiliar moved through Nadia's chest, jealousy arriving before she could fully suppress it. She returned her attention to the manuscript with slightly more focus than the work strictly required, refusing to let the feeling show on her face. Later, after Isabella left, Dante found Nadia noticeably quieter than usual, her careful composure carrying an edge he had not seen before. Something shifted while Isabella was here, he said, watching her carefully. You became far more focused on the manuscript than the manuscript actually demanded. I am simply working, Nadia said, not looking up. You are avoiding looking at me, Dante corrected gently, which you have not done since the first day you arrived here. What changed? Nadia set down her tools, something honest and slightly reluctant crossing her expression. She touches your arm like someone who has earned the right to that gesture through years of closeness, she said. I found myself wondering exactly what that closeness actually means, and then found myself annoyed at myself for wondering, given that you and I technically do not have any arrangement that would make it my business. Something warm and slightly surprised crossed Dante's face. Isabella and I have known each other since we were children, he said. Our families are connected through business. There has never been anything romantic between us, not once, and she would be the first person to confirm that if you asked her directly. I was not going to ask her directly, Nadia said. I was simply going to quietly feel complicated about it and move on. I would rather you did not move on quietly, Dante said, stepping closer. I would rather you told me exactly what you are feeling, even when it is messy, especially when it is messy. I have spent 14 months watching you from a distance specifically to avoid this kind of complication, and now that the distance is gone, I find the complications are the part one actually want. Something in Nadia's chest eased completely at that, the jealousy dissolving into something steadier, something that felt far more like genuine trust beginning to settle into permanent shape. You are watching me again, she said one evening, catching his reflection in the glass of the display case she was carefully organizing. I have been watching you for 14 months, Dante said, something raw and honest breaking through his usual composure. The only difference now is that I am no longer pretending I am not. Something cracked open in Nadia's chest at the directness of it. Why did you never say anything before? She asked. 14 months is a long time to carry that silently. Because saying it meant making you visible in my world, Dante said. And making you visible meant making you a target. The exact thing that happened with Voss is precisely what I was trying to prevent by maintaining that distance. And now that it happened anyway, Nadia said, now I am finding I would rather be honest about what I feel than continue pretending the distance actually protected either of us. Dante said, clearly did not. And I am tired of watching you from across a room when I could simply be standing beside you instead. If you thought the professional arrangement was going to stay professional, you are exactly where this story wanted you, because what happens when Voss finally makes his move changes everything. The break came 5 weeks into the arrangement, when Nadia, working late through a particularly dense section of the manuscript, discovered something neither she nor Dante had anticipated. The financial records Voss believed would challenge the Ferraro port contracts actually contained far more damaging information about Voss's own organization. Detailed records of payments his family had made decades earlier to corrupt port officials. Payments that, if made public, would not only invalidate his claim but expose his entire operation to federal investigation. He does not actually know what is in this manuscript, Nadia told Dante, genuine excitement breaking through her usually careful composure. He assumed it contained records damaging to your family. It contains records far more damaging to his own. His entire strategy has been built on a fundamental misreading of what these documents actually say. Dante studied the records she had carefully transcribed, something sharpening behind his expression. If we present this to the right federal contacts, Voss does not simply lose his claim. He loses everything. Exactly, Nadia said. But the presentation needs to be meticulous. These are 70-year-old financial records written in a mixture of Italian and coded shorthand. If they are transcribed incorrectly or presented without proper archival verification, any competent attorney could challenge their authenticity. Then you are the only person who can actually make this work, Dante said, genuine respect carrying underneath the seriousness of his tone. You built the catalog for this entire collection. Your professional verification is what makes these records legally credible. Nadia felt something fierce and proud settle in her chest at that. Then let me do this properly, she said. Give me 1 more week with the original documents, and I will deliver a transcription and verification package that no attorney on earth can meaningfully challenge. She spent the following week working with an intensity and precision that genuinely awed Dante. Watching her carefully preserve, photograph, transcribe, and annotate 70 years of financial records with the same patient, meticulous attention she had brought to every manuscript in 14 months of quietly managing his family's collection. By the end of the week, she had produced a document package so thorough, so precisely verified, that the federal contacts Dante's legal team presented it to moved on Voss within days. Voss's operation collapsed within the month. The decades-old payment records Nadia had uncovered and verified proving devastating beyond anything his legal team could counter. The port contracts remained securely in Ferraro hands, and the threat that had forced Dante to publicly fire the woman he had been quietly watching for 14 months dissolved entirely, resolved not through violence or confrontation but through the specific, irreplaceable expertise of a librarian nobody in that meeting room had thought to look at twice. The formal announcement of Voss's arrest reached the Ferraro offices on a Tuesday morning, and Elena, who had carried the weight of the original public firing with visible discomfort for weeks, made a point of personally delivering the news to Nadia at the brownstone. I owe you an apology, Elena said, standing in the doorway of the workspace, for delivering that termination without questioning it first. I should have pushed back harder, regardless of what Mr. Ferraro instructed. You were doing your job, Nadia said gently, and he was doing what he believed was necessary to keep me safe. Neither of you owed me anything different in that moment. Still, Elena said, something fierce in her voice. You deserved better than being walked out of that meeting like someone who did not matter. I am glad the full story turns out to be far more complicated than what that room saw. Most things worth understanding are, Nadia said, smiling. Renzo visited separately that same afternoon, his assessment of Nadia having shifted considerably from the security concern he had initially raised weeks earlier. I told him 3 weeks ago that his visits here were something else entirely beyond the manuscript, Renzo said, standing in the brownstone kitchen with visible amusement. For the record, I was correct. You seem pleased about that, Nadia observed. I am pleased because he has been a different man since this arrangement began, Renzo said. Far more present, more honest, less like someone managing an empire on autopilot and more like someone who actually wants to be inside his own life again. That is not something I attribute to the manuscript, Ms. Cole. Nadia, she corrected. If you are going to attribute my presence to your boss's emotional rehabilitation, you might as well call me by my first name. Renzo laughed, short and genuine. Fair enough, Nadia. Dante found Nadia at the brownstone workspace the evening the case formally closed. The tension of the past several weeks finally, genuinely lifted from his shoulders. He stood in the doorway watching her carefully reshelve the last of the manuscripts she had been working with, and something in the quiet, precise care of her movements made him understand, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly how much he had nearly lost by keeping his distance for so long. It is over, he said quietly. Confirmed this afternoon. Voss is finished. Nadia set down the manuscript she was holding, relief settling visibly through her shoulders. Good, she said simply. Dante crossed the room and stopped in front of her, something entirely unguarded in his expression for the first time since she had known him. I need to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly, without worrying about what I want to hear. I always answer honestly, Nadia said. You simply were not asking the right questions for 14 months. Something warm broke across Dante's face at that, the closest thing to a real smile she had ever seen from him. Then let me ask the right one now, he said. Would you consider coming back to the estate, not as a terminated employee being quietly reinstated, but as someone I am hoping might choose to stay for reasons that have nothing to do with a job title? You are asking me to come back, Nadia said. I am asking you to stay, Dante said. Permanently. In whatever capacity makes sense to you. Because I have spent 14 months watching you from the wrong distance, and I would very much like to spend the next long while standing exactly where I should have been from the beginning. Something in Nadia's chest settled fully at that, warm and steady. I would like that, she said. Though I have conditions. Name them. You never fire me again without telling me why first, she said, smiling. And you let me keep the tea kettle. Dante laughed, short and genuine, the sound surprising both of them. Done, he said, and kissed her there in the small workspace surrounded by carefully preserved manuscripts. 14 months of careful distance finally, completely dissolved into something neither of them intended to let go of. 3 months later, Nadia stood in the restored estate library, her position formally reinstated with a title that now reflected the full scope of her actual contribution to the collection. Dante appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, hers exactly the way she took it. You are staring, she said, not looking up from the manuscript she was cataloging. I spent 14 months staring from across a building, Dante said. I find I much prefer doing it from this distance instead. Good, Nadia said, finally looking up with a warmth that had not existed in 14 months of careful, professional separation. Stay exactly where you are. I have no intention of letting you retreat to the other side of the room ever again. Now tell us honestly which moment actually got you, the public firing that turned out to be protection, or the tea kettle he remembered after 14 months. Drop your answer in the comments, we genuinely want to know which detail landed hardest.